Hi, I'm Angus from Let's Learn English, and I'll be your teacher today. Today we're going to look at the present simple and the present continuous. The most common tenses we use when talking about the present are the present simple and the present continuous. Here we'll look at the form of the present simple. I live in France. You live in France. We live in France. They live in France. He lives in France. She lives in France. Bob lives in France. The negative of the present simple uses an auxiliary verb, don't or doesn't. So we say, I don't live in France. You don't live in France. We don't live in France. They don't live in France. He doesn't live in France. She doesn't live in France. Bob doesn't live in France. Questions in the present simple also need the auxiliary verb do or does. So we say, do I, or do you, live in France? Do we live in France? Do they live in France? But we say does with he, she and Bob. Does he live in France? Does she live in France? Does Bob live in France? The present continuous is formed using the verb to be plus the verb plus ing. So we have I am living in France. Am is part of the verb to be. You are living in France. We are living in France. They are living in France. He is living in France. She is living in France. Bob is living in France. You can see that the verb plus ing, which is called the present participle, doesn't change. It's the auxiliary verb to be that does all the hard work. I am, you are, we are, they are, he is, she is, Bob is. In the negative, it's the same thing. The present participle, living, doesn't change at all. What changes is the verb to be. So we have, I'm not living in France. You aren't living in France. We aren't living in France. They aren't living in France. He isn't living in France. She isn't living in France. Bob isn't living in France. So what changes is I'm not, changes to you aren't, we aren't, they aren't, changes to he isn't, she isn't, Bob isn't. Again with the question, the present participle, living, doesn't change. What does change is the position of the auxiliary verb, to be, which now goes at the beginning of the question, followed by the subject. The auxiliary verb to be changes, just like with the other forms. So the questions are, am I living in France? Are you living in France? Are we living in France? Are they living in France? Is he living in France? Is she living in France? Is Bob living in France? We use the simple present to talk about habits, things that you do every day. For example, Mike gets up at 7 o'clock every morning. We use the present continuous to talk about things happening right now. So Mike gets up at 7 o'clock every morning. Here is Mike. He is getting up now. We also use the present simple to talk about things that never change. Here's an example. Some animals sleep in the day and wake up at night. Another example, Mike works in a supermarket. The present continuous we use for things that happen for a short time. not permanently. So Mike works in a supermarket, but today Mike is working with his brother in the garden.